Hi, I'm Claire Berlinski, and I'm speaking to you from Istanbul, where I've been a journalist for the last 5 years, and I'm here with Mona. Mona, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Mona Eltahawy. I am an Egyptian-born columnist and public speaker on Arab and Muslim issues, and I've been living in the US for the past 10 years.
So, what we are here to talk about today, well, actually, we can talk about anything we like, but I think what might be interesting to talk about are the things that we have both written about banning the burqa and our experiences of living in Islamic countries as women, and our concerns about the difference between radical and moderate Islam and what both those terms mean and what we have seen and why we feel that a lot more attention ought to be paid to the voices of women, Muslim women or non-Muslim women, who are concerned about what Islam means for women. And I'll let you speak next.
It's a subject that I am particularly fascinated with, and I say I became a feminist when I lived in Saudi Arabia as a teenager, and it was those years during which I saw how Islam was used to justify misogyny.
Let me just interrupt for a second. Where did you grow up as a child before you moved to Saudi Arabia?
Well, I was born in Egypt, but my family moved to the UK when I was 7. So we moved to Saudi Arabia from the UK, which was an awful shift for me. It was like my world turned upside down. And in Saudi Arabia, I was basically kind of caught between the Islam that I was taught at home. And my parents are both physicians with PhDs, so there's nothing, misogynistic about my family. But the Islam that I also saw being practiced in Saudi Arabia that was very misogynistic and treated women like children. So I became a feminist in Saudi Arabia because that was my way of creating a space for me in my faith that was independent of what the Saudis had done to Islam, basically. I take that and it colors everything I do, whether it's I'm speaking on Muslim women in Europe, as I just did, or writing columns in support of burqa bans across the world, which I do. Because as a Muslim woman, I hate this equation of the disappearance of women with piety.
Right. And rightly so. It's extraordinarily offensive. When you talk about the Saudis having done something to Islam, do you think I think that's a point that really needs to be made over and over, the extent to which a particular understanding of Islam is coming out of Saudi Arabia and is being promulgated around the world with a lot of money behind it. And it is absolutely not the only Islam there is, or the only interpretation of Islam that people who call themselves Muslims will assign. But there's a curious willingness among a lot of Western critics of Islam to say that something very close to the Saudi interpretation, the Wahhabi interpretation, is the correct interpretation. I find this very bizarre. And I wonder if you can tell me, because I am asked this all the time. I'm told, well, Claire, you are always talking about the existence of moderate Islam, but this is not in fact what the Quran says, and it's not actually a legitimate interpretation of Islam to talk about an Islam where women aren't covered. And I wonder how theologically you understand the difference between the Islam that you practice and the Islam that you encountered in Saudi Arabia.
Well, to put it succinctly, if I believed Islam was the way the Saudis portrayed it, I would no longer be a Muslim, because I hate their interpretation of Islam that much. I think the Saudis get away with it for two reasons. Because on the international stage, obviously, their cachet is oil. So nobody dares stand up to the Saudis because they basically fuel, half the world's energy needs. But even more importantly, and I think this is where it's not talked about enough, on the Muslim stage, the Saudis have basically guilt-tripped the Muslim world into shutting up and accepting their version of Islam because they act like they own Islam. Their king in the 1980s called himself the custodian of the two holy mosques.
Yeah, well,
they essentially
historic reason for that, yeah.
Right, and they're the gatekeepers to Islam's two holiest sites. You can't go on pilgrimage to Mecca or Medina, the number one and the number two holiest sites for Muslims, without getting a visa from the Saudis. So, there are many of us who identify as liberal Muslims who detest the Wahhabi interpretation of Islam, who believe that those holy sites should become international cities, for example, and the Saudis shouldn't act like they own them. So I think that many of us need to challenge, not just non-Muslims, but Muslims too, need to challenge the Saudi version of Islam.
It's not uniquely the Saudi version of Islam, though. There are quite a number of schools and interpretations of Islam. I mean, in fact, if you speak to many religious authorities here in Turkey, even if they'll embrace a position which I absolutely admire, which is that religious authorities in the state should not be intermingled, they'll say, yes, but there is a 14th century's worth of tradition saying that women should cover. So it's our spiritual advice to you, even if it's not our legal recommendation that you should cover.
So you're talking about women's issues specifically, right?
Yeah. Actually, I mean, I don't want to just talk about. I mean, it's not all about women's issues. There are many different issues to look at, but women's issues are a particularly striking way to look at it, because I think for most Westerners, this is a black and white issue. You know, it's the subordination of women to an unequal status legally, and the abuse of women is absolutely unacceptable, and I'm very comfortable in saying that. And I think there are a lot of other principles of Islamic doctrine where people can say, well, it's different, but it's not unacceptable. This is one where I think we can say it's unacceptable. And so I'm interested in how well justified from an Islamic perspective do you think a feminist point of view is, or even one that's not feminist in the sense that even just even a point of view that sees equal rights in the law for women. How well justified do you think that is in theological terms?
It's absolutely justified. I mean, before I even answer that, it's also really important to make it clear that in the majority of Muslim majority countries, the legal system has been entirely modernized when it comes to business dealings, when it comes to criminal courts, etc., except for the area of family law, which is obviously the area of women and children, essentially. So when it comes, my country of birth, Egypt, for example, has completely modernized its legal system, but for marriage, divorce, inheritance, child custody, etc., Christians follow church law and Muslims follow what Egypt calls Sharia or Islamic law. So obviously every country interprets it in whatever way it wants, but that's the only area of the law that they claim to kind of pay allegiance to Islam to. And then when I answer how is it possible then to have a feminist interpretation of Islam, I always refer people to a movement that I belong to called Musawa, which is the Arabic word for equality. This movement was launched in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia last year, and it brought women and men from across the world who believe that their goal essentially is equality and justice in the Muslim family. And one of the founders of this movement, a Malaysian Muslim woman called Zaina Anwar, very poignantly said on the day that the movement was launched that justice is necessary and possible within Islam. And they brought together Muslim scholars whose work is especially important, because what they do is they're interpreting Islamic law, and they're saying that the values of equality and justice are in Islam, and we're going to show you that they're in Islam by pointing to all the different sources that you've been using up until now. But they also use international law and international conventions. They use constitutions of various countries. You live in Turkey, for example, that is trying to join the EU, and its constitution has made men and women equal. And they also, just as importantly, use what they call the lived realities of women, which is how these so-called Islamic interpretations actually affect women's day-to-day life. So I, as a Muslim and a feminist, I'm proud to belong to this movement, and I always point to it and say, this is feminism at work today in the 21st century for Muslim women around the world.
Now, I wonder, how much support do you think that this kind of reform movement really has in the Islamic world? I mean, and let's not be vague about it, because the charge that is usually made, and I don't know how right it is, because I really don't know how right it is yes, of course you can always find reformers, you can always find people who will speak out about this, but there's simply not enough numbers to be politically influential in the Islamic world. And I don't think this is true in Turkey, but I'd be curious to know what you think about other parts of the Islamic world. Do you think, for example, that it's politically meaningful in Egypt, in Malaysia, in Pakistan, what do you think the numbers are?
It's difficult to give it numbers because in many of those Muslim majority countries, there are essentially dictatorships at work that for the longest time have used Islam to fight the political Islamic organizations or Islamists in the country. So everybody acts like they're the guardians of Islam and use their religion to fight each other. And, you know, and the net result has been that they've basically sucked out the oxygen of any kind of opposition movement that does not have some kind of Islamic flavor to it. But what I can tell you is that whenever I give talks on women's issues, be they in Europe, as I just did. I just returned from the Netherlands, Germany, and Monaco. And in all those countries, when I tell people about, and in the Middle East as well, and parts of Asia where I speak, whenever I talk about Musawa, there is a huge hunger for wanting to know more about it, because a lot of Muslim women are convinced that the way that the dictatorships that they live under, and the way that the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, or other Islamist organizations like Hamas, like Hezbollah, like all these others who act like they're the pure kind of Muslim version that, you know, you can't get purer. They detest, many women I meet detest the way that they portray women. And they want someone to tell them, your religion does not hate you. You know, I came across an Egyptian woman who lives in the Netherlands. I learned that she wrote this book called Allah Hates Me. And and it really saddens me that someone feels compelled to write this book. I understand where it comes from. But at the same time, I met all these Dutch Muslim women who are politicians in their countries, you know, various parties, who remain firmly Muslim. And, you know, one of them was a lesbian policewoman who remains firmly Muslim and does not feel that she has to choose between the two. So you never hear of these stories, and it's these women who I'm convinced are going to change Islam. It's women who will change the Islam that we know today.
Yeah, I think you're almost certainly right about that, because women who have absolutely the most stake in changing Islam, and because the ideas that are coming, I think, from the West they're inescapable. At some point, they have to penetrate. I wonder, though, do you feel that, you know, I'm a contributor to a site called Ricochet.com, where it's Ricochet, like a bullet, ricocheting.com, and I should spell that out because we've had a lot of conversations about the issue of moderate Islam and what is moderation in Islam and how do you recognize it. And I think it's extremely poorly understood that organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood are promoting a certain version of Islam very widely, and in many cases being spokesmen or front groups for the Muslim Brotherhood are being taken as examples of moderate Muslims when they are not, when their affiliation is really anything but. And I'm wondering who you feel it's worthwhile to talk to in the West, and who you feel really needs to be rejected on the grounds that the association is just too grotesque. That, you know, you can't go and have and speak at certain kinds of conferences and then come back and say, I'm a moderate and I'm actually, you know, in favor of women's rights, although, you know, like Tariq Ramadan, I can't actually come out and firmly say I'm against the stoning of women.
Two things. I think when we talk about ideas from the West moving to the Muslim world to inspire feminism, it's important to remember that there are already movements in the Muslim world, in different parts of the Muslim world, that have been energizing feminist movements. Musawa, for example, was launched in Malaysia for a reason, because one of the founding groups behind the movement is a women's rights group, a Muslim women's rights group called Sisters in Islam, which was launched in Malaysia many years ago. In Turkey, as you know, there are, you know, feminists who have been working on these issues for years. Turkey is both of the East and the West. And in Egypt, my country of birth, as far back as 1923, a feminist, Hoda Sha'rawi, famously removed her face veil and said, this is a thing of the past, in 1923. So it's really important for me also, as a Muslim woman and a feminist who straddles the East and West, that we remember the feminist movements in these various parts of the world, because we're often attacked as being imitators of the West and as given into cultural imperialism from the West.
What would be wrong with it being a Western idea? Why would that be a problem with it? I mean, Islam is supposed to be a universal religion, and what would be wrong with the... You bristled when I said it's a Western idea. I don't think there's a problem with it being a Western idea. I'm perfectly happy to accept that there might have been simultaneous ideas in the Islamic world that resembled it, but it doesn't seem to me to be a serious criticism to say that these ideas have entered via the West, that certain Enlightenment ideas, that certain legal ideas have entered via the West. Mm-hmm. Do you think it is?
I think for a lot of Islamist groups and ultra-conservatives in various parts of the Muslim world, they make it a problem that it comes from the West.
Yeah, it's their problem, right?
Exactly, yeah, it's their problem. I mean, I embrace feminism everywhere, but as I said, I emphasize that we have homegrown indigenous feminist movements, because when they say this is from the West, it creates this knee-jerk defensiveness, and people immediately put up these shutters and say, this is the Americans trying to brainwash us. And my conversation is, no, it's not. This is something that we all have in our history. And that as a Muslim woman, I have this, I have Moroccan sociologist Fatima Mernissi, who has been writing about these issues for years. I have Malaysian feminist Zaina Anwar, who has been writing about this for years. I also have American Muslim scholar and feminist Amina Wadud, who has been writing about this for years. So yes, it's in the West, it's in the East. I hate these definitions. But as someone from the so-called East, the way that I disarm their defensiveness is to tell them that this is not something we're imitating, this is something that we've had in our own history for a really long time. And when it comes to the Muslim Brotherhood, I think you make a great point, because the Muslim Brotherhood are portrayed as so-called moderates vis-a-vis Al-Qaeda and radical extremist groups. So you get a lot of think tanks who say, look, when you talk about Islamists, you have to distinguish between the violent kind, like Al-Qaeda, and the non-violent kind who renounced violence a long time ago, like the Muslim Brotherhood. That's all fine and dandy, but they're not the
The Muslim Brotherhood hasn't renounced violence, and it was just a big statement from the head of the Muslim Brotherhood. But I don't want to interrupt your point. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. I mean, but this is the way that they're portrayed, right? Yeah. That they renounce violence, and this is how we distinguish them from
idiots. Yeah.
But for me as a Muslim, that's not enough, and for non-Muslims, surely that's not enough too, because all you're doing is you're essentially talking again about that right wing in Islam, what I call the Muslim right wing. What about the rest of us? What about the rest of the spectrum who don't feel represented by the Muslim Brotherhood? And so when you get non-Muslims and Muslims holding up the Muslim Brotherhood as the best answer, I'm dismayed. The Muslim Brotherhood came out at the end of 2007. They came out and said, okay, here's our draft platform finally. Oh, and by the way, women and Christians can't be presidents. How can someone, how can a movement that says that be considered moderate? They're discounting half the population in Egypt, and they're discriminating against Christians, and yet we're talking to them as moderates? That's nonsense.
Yeah, no, I agree completely, and I wonder why it is that genuine moderate voices, and they absolutely exist, I met so many and spoken to so many, who are genuinely friends of Western Enlightenment values, and who also genuinely hold themselves to be practicing faithful Muslims. And I'm certainly not going to tell anyone who says to me, I am a Muslim and I interpret the Quran this way, that that you're wrong. You can only interpret it one way. Why is it that these voices are so rarely heard compared to this large section of, I guess, very mediagenic, so-called moderate Muslims who, when you scratch the surface, you don't even have to scratch very far, are embracing positions that are simply incompatible with human rights or Enlightenment values? Why is that?
That is a great question, Claire, and I would answer it, two ways. One is the moderate voices, the really moderate, and I even have a problem with kind of moderate.
The word moderate, because it sounds like it's not faithful, it's not pious. As if you don't take your religion that seriously. Thank goodness. Right. You can be kind of a secular Western cool person like us because you're not really serious about God.
Exactly, and so my definitions are usually kind of conservative, liberal.
Much better words, and I agree with that. And I use them. Yeah, and
they go towards answering your question, because I think the reason that voices like Amina Wadud and Abdul Ilahi An-Naim, a Sudanese American who teaches at Emory and who is one of the leading voices of liberal Islam, and whose latest book is called Islam and the Secular State, in which he actually makes the argument that the state must be secular in order for me, as a Muslim,
it must be secular for religious choice to make any sense. For anyone to have any legitimate faith, it has to be uncoerced. And this is not an uncommon argument in Islamdom at all. I mean, I hear it a lot, but I don't.
Because if the state
I'm sorry, I'm interrupting you.
if the state runs after you to pray, or if the state runs after you to believe in God, then what's the point of having a free will and, choosing to be Muslim? Yeah. So someone like him, why don't we hear about Abdullahi and Naim, but we constantly hear about Tariq Ramadan, the Muslim Brotherhood, all these other guys. Yeah. And you have so many other scholars, and I put it to you that the reason that we don't hear about them is because both non-Muslims and conservative Muslims are trying to make us all believe that the only authentic kind of a Muslim is the conservative kind. Yeah. That conservatism equals authenticity. And myself and so many others who identify as liberal Muslims are making the argument that no, that Islam is a whole spectrum and nobody owns it, and there are so many different types of Islam. If anybody tells you there's one true Islam, tell them they're a liar. That's my answer to that.
There's another important point, which is that someone who is how can I put this? Someone who is a Muslim, a liberal Muslim, is not necessarily going to want to be in power for the sake of advancing a particular kind of Islam. Private faith is exactly the point that we're talking about. If it's a private faith, you are not nearly as likely to be saying, I am putting myself in the spotlight or trying to seize power to advance a particular version of my faith. You're going to be saying, I am doing it for a whole spectrum of values which are universal and which not everyone is going to subscribe to, right? Mm-hmm. So you have someone like Fadila in France. She is not running for office. She is not in office as a Muslim. She is there as a French citizen. It doesn't mean she is not a Muslim, and it doesn't mean but her convictions are obviously private.
Yeah, that is a fantastic point, because when you look at someone like Keith Ellison, he's the first Muslim member of Congress. He was elected in Minnesota. Mm-hmm. He ran on a progressive liberal agenda. He did not run on a Muslim agenda. He ran to represent Minnesotans who believe in social justice, in progressive values, and he happens to be a Muslim. Mm-hmm. And when I interviewed him in 2006, shortly after he was elected, or 2007, he said, I'm a Muslim, I'm a proud Muslim, but I'm in Congress as a representative from Minnesota for people who believe in liberal values, progressive values, and that's how I campaigned. And so that's often lost, because people want this conservative, very, very tight definition of what a Muslim is. And the Muslim Brotherhood and Islamists are only too happy to deliver on that. But what it means is that you end up ignoring the rest of us who are saying, we are Muslim, but so many other things. And it's not just about Islam and the religion. I hear from so many Muslims I know. I spoke on a panel in Oklahoma, of all places, called My America, My Islam, in which a professor of, I think, political science of Moroccan descent said, I don't just identify as a Muslim. I'm a human being. I'm a human rights defender. Why don't people want to talk to me about art and literature? Why do they just want to talk to me about Islam? So, we don't just define ourselves as Muslim, but it's that narrow spectrum that the Muslim Brotherhood uses that everybody then finds us lacking in. And that's where conservatism equals authenticity is used against us.
Yeah. And there's a real sloppiness, there's a real laziness about asking. There are a few very mediagenic personalities who have sold themselves as the voice of moderate Islam, and who have basically they impose this kind of blackmail: deal with me, or we won't be able to control our radicals. If you don't encourage me, then the radicals are going to take over. And there's a laziness on the part of a lot of journalists who are willing to say, yes, well, this is the moderate face, and not to look for other people who are serious scholars and who would be very happy to talk on television, but for some reason aren't on that roster of people you call when you want the moderate Muslim voice.
And they're not on the roster because they make these very complex, nuanced arguments that, funnily enough, a lot of people listening would agree with, and that makes them question. Sometimes I'll be giving a talk about Islam and women's rights, or Islam and political reform, anything, and I can guarantee I'm going to be asked, how representative are you? And implicit in that question is, you make too much sense and we can actually have a conversation. So you can't really be a Muslim because we're not supposed to agree. Do you know what I mean? So it's already set up where if I feel I have anything in common with you, you're not. You have to be too different for me to be able to feel that you're a Muslim and I'm not. And that's where that conservative equals authentic equation is used against us. It doesn't have to be that way, but as you said, many people in the media are looking for a particular type of Muslim, and when you use that definition, the rest of us fail, which I find, which is incredibly offensive, because I'm a Muslim and I'm not going to have my Islam stripped away just because someone wants someone scary and someone who doesn't make sense.
I understand why it infuriates you, but I think there's also a reality too, which is that people of your views are a minority in the Islamic world. That if you did polling in almost every Islamic country, you would not find a huge amount of support for certain propositions, such as there should be a complete barrier between mosque and state. What percentage of people in most of the world's Islamic country would agree with that? I think in Turkey you'd probably find a pretty high percentage, but I don't know outside of Turkey whether that concept would get a lot of support.
For secularism, the complete separation of mosque and state, I'm not sure. Honestly, I probably would be in a minority. But when it comes to issues like women's rights, when it comes to issues of expanding the political atmosphere or the political stage so that it's not just the dictator or the Islamist group like the Muslim Brotherhood, you will find many more people stepping forward and saying, I don't identify with either the dictator or the Islamists. And it's really difficult to kind of gauge. I think the majority of people are kind of somewhere in the middle, but because these dictators have,
and that's a difficult concept to understand. That there can be it's not really a case of you're either an absolute moderate or an absolute radical. There's probably a 1 to 10 scale, and most people are mostly concerned with getting on with their lives without having anyone give them a hassle and earning a living, and are not even really that political at all, and maybe haven't thought through a lot of their cherished beliefs. So you're not really dealing with something with something where you can have a very concrete, clear test when you're talking about real people as opposed to political figures.
Right, you're right, but see, when you make the question something that they can understand because it affects their day-to-day life, for example, when you tell them, do you think it's very Islamic, or do you think it's respectful of Islamic values that the dictator of your country, be he President Mubarak of Egypt, for example, who's been in power for 29 years, or the Saudi royal family, which runs everything in Saudi Arabia, do you think it's Islamic that there are so many poor people in the country? Do you think it's Islamic, the human rights violations that are rampant in those countries? Do you think it's Islamic that they are such hypocrites and they use these double standards to silence people they don't like? I think the majority of people will tell you absolutely not. But it's never asked in those terms. It's always asked in terms of, you have to choose between him and the Islamists. You have to choose between being a Muslim or abiding by these Western values of secularism. And so we step in and say, they're not Western, because here's someone like Abdul-Ilahi An-Naim, a very proud Muslim, who says that as a Muslim, I insist that the state is secular. Do you see what I mean? So it depends on how you ask the question.
Yeah, I'm saying you responded by saying that you felt offended when people looked at you and seemingly asked you to prove your secularism, to prove your moderation. And I'm saying I don't think that being offended is completely rational, because I think there are really good reasons that people are asking that. There's reasons that people are saying, we're worried that there aren't very many of you, and so what do we do about this? I don't think that's. It would be offensive if people were saying something that was so completely divorced from the reality of the modern Islamic world. But I think that there's a rational question that's being asked too. There's a rational question that's being asked too, and I think the point too that. No, I'm sorry. I'm not going to interrupt. Go on with what you were saying. Go on.
No, I would actually like to continue with the point you just made, because the reason I find it offensive is because people who make that point know so little about Muslim majority countries or about Islam or about this kind of vibrant, vigorous debate that is happening within Islam. And their information on Islam is set by the media, the very same media that we've both agreed go to a very particular type of Muslim. So the equation is already set against me to begin with. And one of the questions that I get asked a lot lately is, what has happened in Egypt, for example, that it's become so conservative? And I try to place it in kind of the pendulum across the world that has really swung towards the right. Because then I ask them, what's happened in the Netherlands, for example? As I said, I just got back. What has happened in the Netherlands that has allowed someone like Geert Wilders to be a kingmaker in the government. What has happened in the US?
Well, I think the answer to that is Theo van Gogh. I think that's really clear. I mean, I think that was a pivotal event in the Netherlands, and in conjunction with a number of other
Van Gogh, Claire. Not just that. I think it's because the Netherlands as a whole has refused to have this very difficult conversation about what it means to be Dutch, about what it means to be Muslim, and people want that conversation, but it's been stifled. What has happened here in the US, that the Tea Party has emerged as this kind of renegade faction of the Republican Party, and they claim to represent both Christianity and conservatism. So I think that's a
caricature of the Tea Party. In fact, I know it's a caricature of a Tea Party that doesn't quite make sense.
But I wouldn't confuse I think that they're part of this rightward swing of the pendulum that a lot of people find really disarming, and they don't identify with it at all. Why is it a caricature? Tell me.
Well, let's just back up, because I want to distinguish what's going on in the United States from what's going on in Europe. They're two separate phenomena. I think the Tea Party is really reaction I don't think the Tea Party has a lot to do with Islam at all, or with immigration at all. Or if it has to do with immigration, it has to do with immigration from the Mexican side of it, not from the Islamic world. And I think the Tea Party is a movement above all, toward fiscal conservatism and reduction of government spending. But I think that what's going on in the Netherlands, I think you're absolutely right about that. There is a stifling lack of discussion about the real effects of immigration and what it meant to be Dutch, and the failure of the policy of multiculturalism. And that has absolutely something I saw coming as much as 6 or 7 years ago. I thought this is not going to end well, because this is handing the debate over to real extremists, and I don't even consider the most extreme of them. I mean, I'm really worried about the rise of neo-Nazi parties and things like that. Because the debate, the discussion, has been pushed out of the political mainstream. And I think now it is returning to the political mainstream, but it's an overdue conversation. And the parameters of debate have been really narrowed. I mean, it is extremely difficult anywhere in Europe to say there are certain values that are absolutely non-negotiable if you're going to be here in Europe, without being called a racist immediately. I mean, which is ridiculous, because Islam isn't a race. So I don't think the Tea Party should be conflated with this. I think that's an analytical mistake.
But I didn't make the point that the Tea Party is reacting to Islam.
I'm sorry, I misunderstood if that's what you were saying. I misunderstood. You're saying it's a reaction.
No, I was saying it's reactionary, and each country is reacting to a different thing. But what I'm doing is I'm putting it in that global swing of the pendulum towards the right and towards ultra-conservatism that is obviously a reaction, again, to respective conditions. But here in the US, I mean, you can make the argument that it's a reaction to this conversation that we all deny, or that we all refuse to have on race, on class, on immigration, not necessarily Muslim, but on immigration of all kinds. And in Europe, I mean, I've spent the past 2.5 weeks in Europe essentially talking to Muslims there who are also fed up of not having this conversation. Because what it's done is, in the same way that, as you pointed out, it's handed the extremists, they basically own the conversation on values and what being a European is and immigration. It's also handed the conversation over to the Muslim right wing over what it means to be Muslim in Europe. And none of my Dutch Muslim friends want to be told by either Geertwilders or the neo-Nazis or the Muslim right wing in their communities what it means to be a Dutch Muslim Moroccan woman, for example, who is a politician in the Green Party, or what it means to be a Dutch Muslim woman in Germany who is an artist, or any other identifier. And these are difficult conversations that for the longest time and people would just refuse
even
to
now,
have. And
someone like Merkel is coming out and saying, in Germany, she's saying, well, multiculturalism has been an abject failure, and we must reject that, and we must ask immigrants to learn German and to obey the law. And this is being greeted as this major policy speech. She's actually been saying that for years and years, and so have many politicians. But what she's not talking about specifically is, what does it actually mean beyond learning to speak German? What are the values that we absolutely insist upon? And what I didn't hear from her, again, is anything about women's rights. I didn't hear from her anything about the specific positive values of the Enlightenment and the things that you absolutely must positively believe in order to be, as she puts it, integrated. And then a week ago she rejected the phrase assimilation. So she's not being very clear about what the difference is. And at the same time, you've got Erdogan coming to Turkey and once again reiterating, which isn't making the news, assimilation is a crime against humanity. And so there's no one who's really speaking frankly about what is the baseline minimum that you need to accept to be here. And that is absolutely ceding this conversation to people who are going to say, you can't be here at all. You'll never fit in. It's beyond you to ever be a good European. Go home. Right? I mean,
it's also ceding the conversation to people who say, look, they hate you. This is the Muslim right wing now. Look, they hate you and they don't want you here and they're trying to dictate your, the way you should live your life and they're trying to destroy your religion. And it's creating this defensiveness on both ends of the extremes of the spectrum. And people have been having this conversation amongst themselves, but nobody wants to hear.
That's exactly that is the extraordinary thing, the difference between the conversations people have among themselves and the conversations that are reported in the media or part of acceptable political discourse.
And that's a failure. That's a failure on behalf of the politicians and the media. And at the end of the day, all these young Muslims who live in the Netherlands, Germany, the UK, France, or whatever, someone like Fadila and her organization, Nisumis, I mean, they've been talking about women's rights all along. They've been saying that the women, the working class Muslim women of the French housing projects, who are A, discriminated against generally, and B, discriminated against within their own communities, who's speaking out on their behalf. And what does it mean to be a Muslim woman in France today? In a country where women have been struggling for women's rights for so long, this is not a new conversation for those women. Yeah. And unless those women, unless Muslim women especially, are included in this conversation, it's not going to go anywhere. Because if anyone tries to speak, I don't want anyone to speak on behalf of Muslim women. I had a good Dutch Muslim woman in the Green Party, for example, tell me in Amsterdam just 2 nights ago, I don't want someone to speak on my behalf. I can say what I want and what I need as a Dutch Muslim, but listen to me, hear my voice. And so we must not leave it to the extremists, but we must also involve Muslims front and center in this conversation, because that's the best way to disarm any ridiculous accusations of Islamophobia and racism and bigotry. This is an absolutely necessary conversation to be had.
No, I agree. And it's totally unhelpful to the conversation to dismiss people's concerns as being racist or Islamophobic, and it's equally unhelpful to the conversation to assert there is no conversation we can have because Islam is totally monolithic and there is no one to speak to, and if they claim to be speaking on behalf of Islam, well, then they're not really a Muslim, which is just it's maddening to me to hear that. It's maddening. It makes no sense whatsoever. It's not an argument that we applied to any other. It's as if all rationality just falls out the door when that argument is entered into the equation, because no one would ever say, well, 1.3 billion people all feel exactly the same way about anything else.
It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous that the reductionism that is used. It's ridiculous that, once again, the conservatives in Islam and non-Muslims are all looking to a very particular type of Muslim that they hold up as the authentic, real deal. And that you can use that to explain so much, whether it's what's going on in the Muslim majority countries or the failure of this, the inability to have this conversation in various European countries. We were talking about caricatures earlier, and Islamophobia and Islam, basically. The right wing in Europe caricatures Islam or Muslims by saying they cannot function except like this because Islam is monolithic and they don't belong here and they can't be European. And the Muslim right wing is caricaturing everyone who wants to challenge their version of Islam as being Islamophobic. And who pays the ultimate price? It's women. Women pay the ultimate price because they're basically having this conversation over their heads. And while I totally support banning the burqa and the niqab across the world, Europe or not Europe, what I find dismaying is that all these men suddenly discover their feminism and discover their love of women's rights. When it comes to the way
I can't tell you how much I hear that. It's a human rights issue. You've got to be able to worship as you see fit. It's a personal choice. Well, interestingly, this doesn't seem to apply across the board. It's just there's this deep enlightenment spirit that just comes out when it comes to covering a woman up.
Exactly, and the very same right-wing politicians who are pushing for banning the burqa, they don't care about Muslim women. This is a political tool that, and that's why I say I put myself firmly in between the two right wings.
Let's be really specific. Which right-wing politicians do you think don't care about women?
Oh, I don't think Geert Wilders cares about women, specifically Muslim women. I mean, he goes around saying Islam is a retarded culture. He compares the Quran to Mein Kampf.
Where do you think the energy behind Wilders' emotion comes from in this case? I mean, I think that you're, he is, I think, speaking from a very personal sense of the culture I'm seeing here is going to come for me, because for the obvious reason.
Oh, say that again. I don't understand the point you're making.
He's gay. And he's looking at this and he's saying, this is, the emotional energy there is coming from the sense of it is irreconcilable. The Islamic point of view on homosexuality that I'm seeing around me is irreconcilable with my civil liberties. So why do you think he would have no sense of that applying to women as well?
But my argument would be
I know, your argument is that he's only looking at the extreme perspective.
Of course, because I know gay and lesbian Muslims. I would ask him to watch the film A Jihad for Love on gay and lesbian Muslims across the world, in which Muslims insist they will not choose between their sexual orientation and being gay or lesbian or trans or, any other identifier. And as I said, I met a Muslim woman in the Netherlands who was openly a lesbian, and everybody knows it's not a secret. And, I agree, there are Muslims who have difficulty with gay and lesbian issues and will tell you, they're bound for hell. But I also know Muslim scholars. I know an openly gay imam called Imam Daya Abdullah, who is currently on a tour of Europe to talk to Muslim communities there about being gay, lesbian, and Muslim. So, but I don't understand where Geert Wilders could even pretend to care about Muslim women.
I think it's not fair, though, to say that he has no concern for women here. I don't think you can read anything that he said, I don't think you can read that from anything he said. I think that what you're saying is you don't agree with his argument about Islam, but I don't think it's fair to say that it's a completely disingenuous, racist, xenophobic argument for hatred.
I think he's all of those things. I think he's xenophobic. I think he's bigoted. See, I don't usually throw around racist and bigot. I agree, Islam is not a race, so I don't usually throw around bigot just because someone wants to disagree with Islam. I don't want him to even like Islam. But the way that he talks about Islam, the way that he talks about Muslims, I chose to take my headscarf off. I wore a headscarf for 9 years. I chose to take it off. But he calls, women who wear headscarves, these rags on their head. How can I assume that he has any respect for the women that he's talking about? Do you know what I mean? There's a fundamental level here that is missing. If he truly cared about Muslim women's rights, he would actually sit down with Muslim women's groups and say, how, as a politician in your country, as fellow Dutch, how can we talk about improving your life in the working class neighborhoods of Amsterdam? Instead, he just insults them. Now, I got to tell you, I disagree with this trial that he's on, because I don't think anyone should stand trial for speech. I have a real problem with trials of, on freedom of expression and freedom of speech. But at the same time, I find him a hateful person, and I totally detest the positions he takes, and I really don't see
apart from him, who else do you think is part of a genuine right wing, a xenophobic, racist,
many. I could point you to the Danish People's Party in Denmark. I can point you to the recently elected right-wing party in Sweden. I could point you to Jean Le Pen and now his daughter Marie Le Pen in France. I could point you to the English Defence League and the British National Party in the UK. There is a disconcerting rise of neo-fascist groups, essentially, in various parts of Europe that are rising up with very xenophobic ideas that conflate immigrants with Muslims, which in Europe is not the case.
I think that, in some of those cases I agree with you, and in other cases I think you're being excessively harsh. But I don't think it's actually necessary to go into a whole taxonomy here. I think the main point is that I think we both agree that a failure to address these issues by the parties that have been in power has led to an explosion of seething sentiment that is at this point it's not helpful. It's not helpful. It's because you have immigrants in Europe. They are there, and they're not leaving, and there has to be some way now. I don't know what that way is going to be, but there has to be some way of integrating or assimilating, and it's not at this point going to. The decision to accept a great amount of immigration was made a long time ago, and it's not reversible. So I don't know what the way forward is, but I certainly think that feminist groups and women's groups are absolutely key, because that's the biggest stakeholder in changing this, or they are the biggest stakeholder in changing this.
Absolutely. And, and the one thing that I left Europe with that keeps me optimistic is that there's an increasing number of European Muslim women who are going into politics. I had, my last night in Amsterdam, I was out at dinner with a group of Dutch women, and, two of them were politicians. I hear of more and more women in different, I know of Muslim women going into politics in Denmark, and, we've already mentioned Fadela, and Rashida Dati was Justice Minister for a while. I think she's now in the European Parliament. So, and I think this really is a way that we here in the US, because we often talk about how American Muslims can act as role models for European Muslims. I think that the political involvement of Muslim women in Europe is a great kind of exemplar of a way forward here in the US for American Muslims. And I think that this across the Atlantic, it's not a one-way flow of role models or examples. I think it's good for us to both learn from each other.
Here's my cat who wants to say hello to everyone and just join the discussion. My moderate feline. When we spoke before, there was something that came up that was really interesting, and I'm searching my brain for it now because I don't want to miss that point, because we were talking about something. Oh yeah, you asked me what can be done to get other points of view, other more liberal ideas. People who have more liberal ideas about Islam, how can they get their views in the media? And I think this is an excellent question, a really important one, and I think that a more comprehensive, serious media strategy is really important. It's not enough to just be sitting in dusty conferences, because the people who are promoting the most extremist views are very skillful. They're really they are really organized and disciplined and on message, and they get the most mediagenic people out there to respond to whatever the latest crisis is in their way. And I don't see that liberal Muslims are doing that as effectively. And it might really be that journalists just are determined to ignore them no matter what they say or do. But I think it's an important point. I didn't ask you last time, but I am curious to know what your take on the AKP in Turkey is from what you've seen of it. I mean, I'm the one who's living here, but I'm just curious what it looks like from the outside to you. When they first came to power, I wrote this column in which I said to be careful not to allow the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, for example, to point to them and say, you see, Islamists are okay, and when they're elected, everything is fine, and there's no need to fear us, because I made a distinction between, the AKP and the Muslim Brotherhood. And I made that distinction by using a litmus test that I came up with. And my litmus test was, what's their position on the West, their position on Israel, and their position on women? And at the time, this was back in 2008, I found that, their position on the West, obviously they want to be members of the European Union. And Israel, Turkey has a long-standing friendly relationship, although recently that is beginning to change. And their position on women, also back in 2008, according to news reports that I'd read, they worked quite well with women's rights groups to resolve issues in the constitution regarding women's rights. Women have dropped out of the workforce. They tried to criminalize adultery. So
according to that litmus test, because the litmus test for me was, this shows that they are kind of so-called post-Islamists, because I know the Muslim Brotherhood would do none of those, or other Islamist movements that I know would do none of those. But I don't live in Turkey, and things have changed since 2008. So back in 2008, I considered the AKP, and basically, Erdogan and Gül and all those guys who left the Welfare Party and then formed a new party, and now the AKP is kind of the grandchild of the Welfare Party, I suppose. Back then, they seemed to me to be post-Islamist, but I don't live in Turkey. So how do you look at them then, and what do you think of my litmus test?
Your litmus test, I think it's actually a very telling one, and those are probably three of the best questions to ask. What's happening to women? Anytime you see a resurgence or an emergence of a totally irrational hostility to Israel, you're in the presence of someone who's trying to hide something, usually how much they're stealing from you. You know what I mean? this stuff, I mean, there are a lot of ways you can look at the AKP's foreign policy and their domestic policy, and it is complicated, but I think basically the commitment to human rights, the commitment to democracy, it's pretty thin. There have been some important steps taken in some directions, but not enough for everyone, and you can't argue with the numbers. When women are leaving the workforce rather than entering it, you've got a problem. When women are feeling more social pressure to cover rather than and very afraid, you've got a problem. There is certainly, I mean, absolutely, I have spoken to many women here who cover and say, we experienced terrible discrimination. We have been scorned. We've been told that we're not welcome. People have looked at us like we're backwards and primitive, and I absolutely believe that. I am certain that there is a total polarization here. And simultaneously, this is kind of strange, but simultaneously there's no polarization because covered and uncovered women they socialize totally freely, and it's not it's not uncommon to see a covered and uncovered woman walking down the street hand in hand, but there is at a political level this terrible mutual fear. And the AKP is not totally, they're not totally lying about that, but the approach that they've taken has resulted in more polarization, not less. It has not reassured anyone on the so-called secular side. The term secular gets misused too, just like the word moderate, because being secular does not mean you're not religious. It means that you are worried about right. So and in the Western media, it's always being described as pious Anatolians versus secular urban elites, and that's not the way it is. It's not the way it is. It's just
And what about issues of class as well? Because I think when it comes to Turkey, isn't it important to talk about class too? Because you're talking about a class, middle class and lower in Turkey that had been traditionally or felt traditionally marginalized by the elites, who were always referred to as secular by the armed forces. And aren't the AKP now supposed to be a kind of the face of this emerging middle class that are kind of confident and flush with cash, but now also wanting a kind of the political
whole emerging middle
that?
Class thing. I mean, there's certainly a whole lot of new billionaires. You know what I mean? And it's. The AKP describes itself as the remedy to an elitism, but they created a new elite. It's not really, and it's they came to power. AKP is a pun. AK Party, the Op Party, the White Party, the Clean Party, as the anti-corruption party, and everyone knows. As a friend of mine put it very chastely, or an acquaintance of mine put it very chastely in an article, there's abundant anecdotal evidence to support stories of government corruption. That's the scientific way of putting it. The whole idea that they represent a genuinely popular revolt against elitism, it doesn't stand up to a whole lot of close scrutiny.
Right.
But go on, sorry.
Well, when it comes to Israel, I mean, one can make a genuine and well-intentioned opposition to Israeli occupation and the way Israel treats Palestinians and the siege of Gaza and all of this, and my own country of birth, Egypt, and its position or its relationship with Israel is very known to me because I chose to live in Israel as a journalist for Reuters news agency, and to this day I'm in trouble with the Egyptian state because Egyptians are not supposed to visit Israel. So I'm very well aware of how Israel is used as this kind of political scapegoat and coat hanger to distract people from anything that is going wrong, be it corruption or political repression. But I mean, what's been happening with the Turkish leadership in Israel, this descent towards populism, I find quite disturbing.
It's very disturbing. It's really disturbing. And it's disturbing in particular, I think it's disturbing because I think that the government doesn't fully understand that this may not be a tiger they can tame. I mean, it's working very effectively for them right now, but how long can they control it? I don't know that I think the charge of their most extreme critics that there is an organized, concerted plan to turn Turkey into the next Iran is absurd. I don't think it's that, but I think that they are playing with fire, and and unaware of how serious these kinds of sentiments can become and how they can start driving the political agenda rather than simply suiting it.
Right, and it doesn't help, of course, that you have someone like Avigdor Lieberman, who's the Israeli foreign minister, and the loyalty oath that was recently passed, because that's grist for the mill.
That wasn't
exactly
helpful.
That wasn't populism, exactly. And at the same time,
although I don't think that really penetrated consciousness here that much. I mean,
well, when it does, then you can like be ready, because that was quite outrageous, wasn't it?
The whole loyalty oath thing is, when I look at something like that, I think, why make your life more difficult? Why make your life more difficult? Don't just, you know what I mean? It's just, but I don't think that. I think that there's a tendency to vastly exaggerate that as an item of importance. And honestly, I don't think that really was in the Turkish media that much compared to other things. The Mavi Marmara incident was, of course, it was
right. The flotilla, right?
Yeah. I mean that was massive. It was absolutely massive, and there still is absolutely no balance given in the Turkish media. There are very few people saying exactly what was the IHH doing there. This was clearly an attempt to not only deliver humanitarian aid, and as a cover for a massive delegitimization exercise, and it was extremely successful. And people aren't asking, what is the AKP's connection to the IHH? What kind of support do they give? These questions really need to be asked. They need to be asked.
Yeah, and it's the same kind of thing as conversations with, many people support Palestinian rights. Many people want the blockade over Gaza to be lifted, but many people also want to ask difficult questions of Hamas and what is Hamas doing to Palestinian society, in the same way that many of my Israeli friends are asking difficult questions of Benjamin Netanyahu and Avigdor Lieberman, and asking there again about that kind of the rightward swing of the pendulum. And this is exactly why I make that point about how globally we've seen this pendulum swing to the right, because there are so many of us who want to have these difficult conversations, and we're finding that the oxygen for them is being sucked out more and more as people are kind of being pushed into taking these polar opposite positions which don't help anyone.
Yeah, I actually agree with that. You know what? I just realized that we have been talking for more than an hour, and they wanted us to talk for 25 minutes.
I know, and I think Sang is like, okay, you guys have to shut up now, I have to go. No, he's not actually saying that, but we've been talking for a long time.
I guess they can edit this and just get the good parts out, right?
Yes. We'll leave it to them to edit and cut. But Claire, as always, it's been a pleasure to talk with you.